Valerie Bertinelli smiled for the cameras. She showed up, stayed kind, and played the part the world expected. But behind closed doors, something was broken. And for 18 years, she refused to face it. She told herself she was healing, that the past was the past, that she had made peace with her divorce from Eddie Van Halen, with the chaos, the grief, the guilt. But the truth was harder to admit. She hadn't moved on. She hadn't let go. And the life she built after the divorce was built on something she couldn't say out loud. Because for nearly 2 decades, Valerie wasn't just hiding pain. She was lying to herself about how much she gave up, about how much she blamed herself, about how much she still loved him, even after everything. And when Eddie died, that silence shattered. Now, what's rising to the surface isn't scandal or resentment. It's sadness, regret, and a kind of grief that doesn't go away just because time has passed. Valerie is finally telling the truth. In the early days, it looked like a fairy tale. Valerie Bertinelli was America's sweetheart, young, talented, and full of life. She rose to fame on one day at a time, her smile as familiar to viewers as their own family. And when she began dating Eddie Van Halen, the electrifying guitarist of one of the biggest rock bands in the world, the media couldn't get enough. It was the perfect contrast. She was grounded and wholesome. He was wild and untouchable. Together, they looked like the unexpected match that just worked. But love stories are rarely that simple. Behind the glowing headlines and red carpet photos, their relationship was moving fast. Maybe too fast. Valerie was barely in her 20s when she and Eddie tied the knot. There was no roadmap, no time to reflect. Just 2 people swept up in the speed of fame, passion, and the illusion that love could fix anything. At first, they truly believed it might. And for a while, it seemed to. Valerie brought a kind of steadiness into Eddie's life. He brought excitement into hers. They were both young and trying to navigate worlds that didn't offer much room for stillness. They leaned on each other, perhaps a little too hard. But something else was happening beneath the surface. As the years passed, the demands of their individual careers and Eddie's well-known struggles with addiction started to cast long shadows over their home. The music world was chaotic, and so was life behind the scenes. Valerie, raised in a more structured, traditional family, found herself constantly adapting to a life that didn't feel stable. She smiled for the cameras, but privately, she was beginning to drift. Not just from Eddie, but from the version of herself she used to know. Still, she stayed, for years, because part of her believed that this was what love meant. Holding on, even when it hurt. She told herself that marriage was about compromise, that it was her role to be the calm in his storm, and that if she could just hold things together a little longer, maybe he'd find peace. Maybe they would. This is where the first cracks formed. Not in the relationship itself, but in Valerie's sense of self. She began making quiet sacrifices, the kind no one else saw. She let go of things she wanted. She softened her voice in moments she should have spoken up. She made herself smaller in ways that were invisible to everyone but her. And slowly, she started believing that this was just how it had to be. That loving someone meant losing a little bit of yourself. To the outside world, they were still the picture-perfect couple. But inside the relationship, Valerie was already starting to disappear. And the scariest part was, she didn't even notice. At that stage, the lie hadn't formed fully, but the silence had. She wasn't telling the world how hard it was. She wasn't telling Eddie either. And she certainly wasn't telling herself. She believed what she had to believe. That it was working, that love would pull them through, that the pain was temporary. But that's the thing about denial. It doesn't always show up in dramatic moments. Sometimes it creeps in slowly, disguised as patience, loyalty, or strength. Valerie wasn't lying to anyone on purpose. She just hadn't realized yet how much of herself she was losing. And by the time she did, the damage was already done. As the marriage settled into its second decade, the illusion of balance became harder to maintain. The charm of opposites attract began to wear thin. What once felt like adventure had started to feel like instability. The things Valerie once brushed off, the late nights, the unpredictability, the emotional distance, became impossible to ignore. What she'd once thought of as temporary became the rhythm of her daily life. Eddie's struggle with addiction was never a secret, not to those closest to him. Valerie, in her quiet way, tried to be his anchor. But addiction doesn't just erode the addict, it erodes everything around them. Promises made one day were broken the next. Plans were always fragile. There were bursts of hope, followed by long stretches of silence. And still she stayed. She believed she could hold it all together, that if she just tried harder, supported more, showed enough patience, things would get better. But better kept getting pushed further out of reach. What made it even harder was the love. It never fully left. It's easy to walk away from someone you hate. But Valerie didn't hate Eddie. If anything, she still saw the man she fell in love with underneath the chaos. And that made everything more complicated. Because when you love someone who is hurting, you start to believe that your job is to save them. That walking away would be selfish. That staying is what love demands. So she stayed. Not because she was weak, but because she thought she was being strong. But strength can become a trap. The more she held on, the more she disappeared. Her own needs were pushed aside. Her voice, the one she had cultivated as a confident young woman in Hollywood, began to fade. In public, she was smiling. At home, she was surviving. And deep down, she had started to believe that this version of life was normal. That this is what commitment looked like. Over time, the cracks widened. Trust became strained. Affection became habit. Their connection was still there, but quieter, harder to reach. The spark that once lit up the room had dimmed to a flicker. And still, Valerie said nothing. Not to the world. Not to her closest friends. Not even to herself. Instead, she told herself she was fine. That she was doing the right thing. That this was just a hard chapter in a long love story. But the truth was beginning to surface in small, painful ways. In the way she stopped laughing the way she used to. In the way she began to second-guess her instincts. In the way she started measuring her worth by how well she held things together, not by how she felt inside. This wasn't a marriage anymore. It was a performance. One she believed she had to keep up. For Eddie, for the public, for her son, and most heartbreakingly, for the version of herself she had promised she'd become. The loyal wife, the steady force, the quiet caretaker. She couldn't see it then, but she had already begun to lie to herself. Not about Eddie, but about the cost of loving someone more than she loved herself. She told herself it wasn't that bad, that things would turn around, that she just needed to wait a little longer. But the waiting never ended, and the person she was waiting for, to be heard, to be valued, to feel safe, wasn't Eddie. It was herself. When the divorce finally happened in 2007, there were no explosive headlines. No bitter battles played out in the press. Valerie and Eddie presented it as a peaceful, mutual decision. They had a son to raise. They had shared too much history to become enemies. And on the surface, it looked like the rare Hollywood divorce handled with grace. But grace doesn't mean healing. And peace doesn't always mean truth. Valerie told herself she was ready. That it was time. That she had tried everything she could. That it was the right thing to do, and it was. But what she didn't tell herself, and what she couldn't quite face, was how much pain she had stored away just to get to that point. For years after the divorce, she stayed silent. She gave respectful answers when asked about Eddie. She said all the right things. But the ache didn't go away. It lingered quietly, steadily, in the background of her new life. She smiled. She moved on. She dated. She remarried. But something inside her still hadn't been addressed. It wasn't about still loving him, though part of her always did. It wasn't about regret, exactly. It was about the story she kept repeating in her own head. That she was fine. That she had healed. That everything had played out the way it was meant to. That was the lie. Not a public lie, not a performance, but a deeply personal one. A private story she told herself to avoid reopening wounds that had never truly closed. She believed she had moved on because she needed to believe it. She had spent so many years holding things together that letting herself fully break down felt dangerous. She had learned how to compartmentalize pain, how to package it neatly and file it away. She convinced herself that the chapter was over. But the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. Certain songs still hit too hard. Certain anniversaries still brought a heaviness. And she couldn't quite explain why some mornings felt so sad, even in the middle of a life that, on paper, looked full. Because grief doesn't follow a schedule. And neither does emotional honesty. In the years after the divorce, Valerie built a new version of herself. She leaned into her career again. She embraced her role as a mother. She even found love again. But in quiet moments, when no one was asking questions, when the cameras were off, she still carried the weight of everything she hadn't said. She hadn't just lost a marriage. She had lost the version of herself that once believed she could fix everything. And that's the cruelest part of denial. It doesn't just distort the past, it robs you of the chance to truly heal. Valerie's silence wasn't just about protecting Eddie's legacy or avoiding media noise. It was about protecting herself from a truth she wasn't ready to face. That she had stayed too long. That she had disappeared into someone else's chaos. That she had paid for love with pieces of herself she never got back. And for nearly 2 decades, she called that peace. Until one day, it became impossible to believe that story anymore. When Eddie Van Halen passed away in October 2020, the world mourned a rock legend. Fans shared memories, musicians paid tribute, and headlines remembered the man who had redefined an entire genre. But behind those public tributes, Valerie was experiencing a loss no one else could fully understand. This wasn't just the death of a famous ex-husband. It was the death of someone who had once been her entire world. And in that quiet, crushing moment, everything she'd pushed aside for 18 years came rushing back. Not just grief, but all the truths she had refused to face. Because for nearly 2 decades, Valerie had told herself she had healed. She had walked away, rebuilt her life, stayed strong. She had kept her pain quiet and dignified. But Eddie's death cracked through all of that. It brought up emotions she hadn't expected. And it forced her to confront the reality she had spent years burying. She had loved him deeply. That had never gone away. But more than that, she had been carrying the weight of what their love had cost her. The years spent trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed. The silence she accepted to keep the peace. The parts of herself she let fade to make room for someone else's struggles. And when he died, so did any illusion that she had fully let go. Suddenly, the memories became sharper, the regrets louder. She couldn't hide from the fact that she had spent years telling herself she was okay, when deep down, she was still stuck in the aftermath of a marriage that never fully closed. There was no longer a chance for closure, no final conversation, no reconciliation, just the silence that had followed her since the divorce, now louder than ever. It wasn't about blame. Valerie wasn't angry. She wasn't pointing fingers. What she felt was more complicated than that. Sorrow, guilt, tenderness, and loss all braided together. She had grieved for Eddie, the husband, long ago. But now she was grieving for something else, the version of herself she'd silenced in the name of keeping everything together. And in the aftermath, she began to understand something she had never allowed herself to say. She had lied. Not to Eddie, not to the public, but to herself. She had told herself she was strong, that she didn't need to revisit the past, that she had done everything right. But beneath that surface-level peace was a lifetime of second-guessing, pain, and questions that never found answers. Eddie's death didn't just reopen old wounds. It exposed how deeply she had buried them. And once the lie cracked open, it couldn't be patched back together. Valerie didn't make grand declarations. There was no dramatic reveal, just a quiet unraveling of years of emotional containment, and the slow, painful realization that being silent hadn't protected her. It had only delayed the grief, because when someone you love dies, especially someone who shaped the person you became, it forces you to re-examine every choice you made along the way, every compromise, every goodbye you whispered to yourself. And for Valerie, it became clear. She hadn't just stayed silent for 18 years. She had stayed lost. In the months following Eddie's death, something shifted in Valerie. Not all at once. There was no sudden breakthrough or tidy transformation. But piece by piece, she started letting go of the story she had been telling herself for so long. The one that said she had to be the strong one. The one that said her pain didn't matter as much as everyone else's. The one that said she had already healed, even when she hadn't. It didn't come from bitterness. It wasn't about rewriting the past. It was about finally facing it. Gently, honestly, and without judgment. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, she stopped trying to make everything okay. She stopped pretending she had moved on just because time had passed. And she started honoring the parts of herself that had been left behind. There was grief, yes, but there was also relief. Because when you've spent years holding something in, convincing yourself that you're fine, that you've let go, that it's all behind you, there's a strange kind of freedom that comes from finally admitting you're not. That you're still carrying pieces of something that hurt, and that it's okay to say so out loud. Valerie didn't go public with anger or blame. She didn't tear down Eddie's legacy or revisit the worst moments of their marriage. That was never the point. The pain she felt wasn't about him alone. It was about the silence she had lived in for so long, and the way she had disappeared inside it. And when she finally began to speak, it wasn't about telling the world everything. It was about telling herself the truth, the one she had avoided for years. That she had lost herself in a marriage that demanded more than it gave. That she had stayed too long in a dynamic that left her emotionally starved. That even after leaving, she kept pretending she was whole. But the truth is, silence is not healing, and survival is not peace. It took nearly 20 years for Valerie to admit that she hadn't truly recovered. That part of her was still stuck in that quiet ache of self-denial. And when she began to say it, not with blame but with clarity, something powerful happened. Women listened, and they understood. Because Valerie's story isn't rare. It's just rarely told. How many women have stayed too long in something that wasn't working? How many have convinced themselves that endurance is the same as strength? How many have smiled through heartbreak, telling themselves it was all for love? Valerie's story is messy. It's complicated. It's tender and tragic. But it's also brave, not because she spoke out, but because she finally listened inward. After 18 years of silence, she didn't uncover some shocking secret. She uncovered herself. And in doing so, she gave permission to countless others to do the same. Not by being loud, not by tearing down the past, but by acknowledging that being strong isn't about hiding the hurt. It's about facing it, even when it's been buried for years. Valerie Bertinelli didn't step into the spotlight to share some long-held secret or to rewrite the story of her marriage to Eddie Van Halen. What she's revealing now is something far more personal and far more painful. She's finally telling the truth about the silence she lived in for 18 years. It wasn't the kind of silence that screams for attention. It was quieter than that. The kind that settles deep inside. The kind that looks like strength to everyone else, but feels like something entirely different when you're alone. For nearly 2 decades, Valerie convinced herself she was okay. She kept going, kept working, kept smiling. She was gracious, respectful, and composed. But underneath that calm exterior was a woman who had never truly healed. A woman who hadn't fully faced what her marriage and her divorce had taken from her. And when Eddie died, the silence cracked open. That's the heartbreak so many fans have felt watching her journey unfold now. Not because she's bitter, not because she's angry, but because she's finally allowing herself to say what so many others have been afraid to. That sometimes we lie to ourselves just to survive. It's not weakness, it's human. And maybe that's what makes her story so powerful. Because in telling the truth now, slowly, quietly, and without apology, she's showing other women that it's never too late to stop pretending. That healing doesn't come from time alone. It comes from honesty, from looking in the mirror and finally admitting what hurt you, even if it was a long time ago. Valerie's story isn't just about divorce. It's about reclaiming the voice she muted for almost 20 years. And in doing so, she's helping others find their own. For more emotional stories, check out this video.